Mr. Spalding is also a policy analyst and an activist. For nearly 20 years, he has engaged in efforts to restore vulnerable ecosystems, to plan for climate change resilience, to create sustainable communities, and to educate our children and youth on the importance of environmental sustainability. Before joining the EPA leadership in 2010, Mr. Spalding served as the executive director of the renowned environmental advocacy group Save the Bay in Rhode Island, where he helped develop advocacy and education programs to restore Narragansett Bay. For his leadership in the construction of the Save the Bay Center in Providence, he won the Phoenix Award. However, he feels much more rewarded for the more challenging parts of his role, like managing to get a permit for a green infrastructure project on a brownfield in 2003. Understanding the intersection between human health and the environment and how we can best protect it is crucial at a time where both have been increasingly threatened. Tackling this challenge is at the heart of Mr. Spalding's work ahead of the EPA's New England region, where he has helped advance a comprehensive agenda for environmental change that encompasses community engagement and prosperity, environmental justice, and the green economy. To discuss these efforts and how they intersect with a more sustainable water future, please welcome Administrator Curt Spalding.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Is there a way I can just close this screen and not have anything, so I can go for my, I have some paper that I just want to use.
Put it down on the side.
That'd be great. I'll let you do that. Thank you. Thanks. Well, thank you very much. That was a fascinating conversation that I heard, especially on the latter part of the panel. And just as a hook for all of you, there was a conversation about radical transparency. If you right now pull out your iPhone or your Android, whatever, and go to ISO to go, you could get an app up that would tell you right this moment how energy is being spent in New England. For example, you would know 50% of our energy is coming from natural gas, 29% is coming from nuclear sources, 13% from renewable, 4% from a hydro, and 1% from coal. You could know that right now if you went to ISO to go. Kind of an interesting thing to keep track of. If you did that 10 years ago, that would be a completely different ratio. Probably a lot more coal, I know a lot more coal, very little renewable, and probably natural gas down around the 20% area. So that just gives you a sense of the kind of emerging transparency that's coming forward. Now, as all of you may know, Sheldon Whitehouse, from my home state, Rhode Island, drove up there from Rhode Island today, is probably the leading voice for climate change on the floor of the US Senate. He has spoken over 118 times on the Senate floor when it comes about climate change and the need to act. Now, in every speech, he talks about why people need to just get their heads around climate change right now. And he speaks to the fact that the evidence for climate change is not about belief anymore, it's about a matter of fact. And I think it was mentioned earlier in the panel, here in New England, we don't need to think about droughts, we don't need to think about episodic events, we just need to think about the fact that our ocean is rising. It's risen 12 inches since the 20s. It will probably rise another 12 inches by 2050. Our water temperature's increased. It's increased 3 degrees since the 50s, and that pace of temperature rise is increasing, is accelerating. Now, these are not variable measures. These measures are one direction and one direction only. And I think that's why when they did some polling recently, it seems that the public is getting their head around climate change. Over 70% of the people accept that climate change is happening and we are contributing to it. Now, how important that is relative to all the things in their life, and given the events in Paris last night and the events around the world around security and those sorts of things, it's understandable why people might push climate change lower on the priority. But they know the acceptance of it is clearly there. So back in 2013, on a really, really hot day, 90 plus degrees, and I don't know how many of you have ever been in Washington. I have to go to Washington in the summer all the time. And I complain about it every time I get on the plane and leave New England. In June 2013, President Obama stood on the steps of Georgetown University, and he spoke for over 50 minutes, talking about the climate action plan that he had been working on with his team for over a year before that. And this was right after the election, as we know. The plan outlined a course of action that is now put us in the place of being a global leader on climate change. It is a multi-pronged approach on climate, one where we must take the challenge of carbon dioxide pollution as well as look at adaptation challenges that are ahead, because we clearly have bought ourselves a serious challenge there. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit first about the mitigation implications of the what's called the Clean Power Plan. And as I was driving up here listening to NPR, as I usually do when I'm running around New England, David Remick, and I think most of you might know who he is. He's one of the highest, most respected journalists in this country, writes for The New Yorker. And he had this question to one of his journalist friends. He said, well, what has the president really done on climate change? And my jaw almost dropped. Because if David Remick didn't know about the Clean Power Plan, I guess the average person in the street probably doesn't know. But it is my opportunity here to share with you what the Clean Power Plan is, how it affects some of what was talked about at the panel. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the water challenge here in New England. And I do want to say with me today is Ken Maraff from our Office of Ecosystem Protection in the regional office. He is actually in charge of all the water and air programs in New England and actually sits on national policy-making boards to talk about all of these things as we go forward. So, with the Clean Power Plan, let's start with what it will do. The Clean Power Plan aspires to slash 32% carbon pollution from the power sector by 2030, starting from a 2005 baseline. It'll cut smog and soot, as well as reduce carbon. In 2030, we expect to see emissions from sulfur dioxide to drop 90% compared to 2005 levels. And if you know anything about the clean air and how it affects our health, this is dramatic, probably beyond measure right now, even beyond the imagination of healthcare professionals in this country. We also will see a dramatic reduction in NOx, probably 72% compared to 2005 levels. That's what the Clean Power Plan is about. Now, how does it work? Well, it sets a uniform emission rate for power plants across the country. We do the calculation the same way wherever they are. It's the same rate for a coal plant in Kentucky as a coal plant in New England. This guarantees equity and fairness. So when we first proposed the plan, that was a criticism. When we made the plan final, we addressed that. Now, here's the challenge about it. States are very different. I just talked about the power mix right now, which are supporting the lights and power in this room in New England. Well, it could look very different in other parts of the country. For example, if you did the same ISO app in Ohio, you'd probably see over 70% of the power is coming from coal plants. So we know every state is different in terms of their mix of renewables, their mix of gas, their mix of coal, their mix of hydro. So this plan is set up to work with each state's situation. They have options. They can run what they have more efficiently. They can convert the dirtier sources, the coal sources, to cleaner sources. They can actually work towards renewables being implemented in their system. So no state has to do it the way we've done it. Now, we have the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that's been operating in New England, I think fully up since about 2008. So we're well into this kind of balancing of energy sources. But in other states, if they don't have that, they have to build a plan that will meet the goals that what we have given each state to achieve. The point is, it's not a one-size-fits-all. It respects the fact that states set energy policy about where their energy is going to come from. So what happens next? We need to see these plans by 2016. Each state will have a separate plan. In some states, for example, New England, will have multi-state plans through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. But the fact is, a lot of this is already rolling. For example, it's rolling here in New England and California where there's markets already in place. What we're really doing is we're setting certainty around the direction of where energy is going to come from as we go forward. It's reasonable. We think this is very achievable and affordable over time. We've run those numbers. We actually have some very sophisticated modeling of what this is going to cost and what the air pollution benefits are. But we have to remember, in our effort to advance the decarbonization of our economy, we have to make sure that economy stays stable. It was said very eloquently, people probably don't care about these state plans and the numbers or even the ratio of where their power comes from. What they do care about is whether the power is available and reliable and it supports their economy. So we have to put a plan in place that keeps that stability and makes sure we're resilient in the very complex, interdependent global economy we work in. It has been a strong economy in that regard. You know, the data most recently about poverty rates dropping around the world, we need to make sure we don't have the unintended consequence of somehow destabilizing that going forward. The last thing I want to bring to you on this is the fact that in the end here, we're talking about setting up a tradable platform in 3 areas of the country. The West, essentially the Mississippi West, the East, as we speak about that, and then Texas. Texas is all by itself, believe it or not. It has a fully closed energy system, which is actually run by what's the least cost to produce. And it turns out Texas has very affordable renewable energy. I don't know if you heard this, but right now in Texas, if you want free energy, you simply need to run your washing machine or your lights or whatever you want that's a high energy consumptive use after 9 o'clock at night. It's free. So what we're seeing here is the development of 3 trading platforms across the country. The Clean Power Plan will hopefully set those market incentives. So we feel actually that the Clean Power Plan will do what Congress wouldn't do at this point, actually put a price on carbon, and it will be traded in these 3 areas with the utility sector actually working that trading system out. I believe it's why at this point when President Obama goes to Paris at the end of the month, we can proudly go to that meeting and say we are taking strong, actionable steps on decarbonizing our economy. Now, I wish I could say that was fantastic and we're on to a future that is without stress or strain when it comes to climate change, but I think we all know that we're probably decades late on this enterprise. It would have been great if we did this even before the turn of the century, back in the 80s and 90s. As it's coming to be, I think a lot of people knew about this, but it wasn't on the top of the conversation at the time. So I think as you all know, there's great stresses coming. The president went to Alaska to show what the future may be for all of us. Because in Alaska, especially for the Indian cultures up there, there's great strain and stress going on. Literally, villages are sinking where they sit. Sea level rise is overcoming their area. Their traditional cultural practices of how they hunt on ice is being impacted. Their lives are being greatly changed by climate change. And in fact, our lives in this region will be greatly changed by climate change because over half the people in New England live on the coast. And if you're from Rhode Island, where I am, where most of Rhode Island is the coast, 420 miles of coastline, smallest state in the Union, there's an unavoidable challenge coming ahead that's very severe for all of us. So climate adaptation has become a priority for everything we do, or everything we think about in our regional office. We're integrating it into almost every decision we make. Sometimes very effectively, I would say. Sometimes we're challenged based on just the regulatory framework that we're burdened with and how we have to operate. When I came to the region, I talked a lot about systems thinking, and now having done this job for 6 years, I realize what a challenge it is to be truly systematic about dealing with a lot of these problems. So in New England, I want to talk a little bit about our water challenge. It is our iconic waters, as we know, that makes New England so very special. We talk about Casco Bay up in Maine, Lake Champlain, Cape Cod, Narragansett Bay, Long Island Sound. These iconic, so important bodies of water are all struggling with a very serious pollution problem that is greatly exacerbated by climate change. It's become a much more complex problem. And it's associated with nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. And we talked about energy. I always like to point out to people, nutrients in water is really energy in water. The nutrients got in the water because we took energy, probably fossil energy, converted it to fertilizer, grew a piece of corn, gave it to a cow. The cow is then slaughtered and eaten in New England, and then that nitrogen that's in our human waste goes into our home toilet. Then it goes to Deer Island, or it goes to your recent wastewater plant, and then it goes into your body of water nearby. It's just energy that's been transferred into our estuarine systems. Of course, what that energy does is it creates algal blooms and stresses that ecosystems. So our challenge when it comes to our iconic water bodies in New England is really about how we deal with this transfer of energy and nutrients into those systems. Now, we've shown we can get great work done here in New England, and Ken was part of this. Boston Harbor is a national success story. Once considered maybe the most polluted estuary or harbor in the nation, it's now looked at as one of the cleanest, with urban beaches that are open. How did we do that? Well, we did it using the authority in the Clean Water Act. Basically, we put a limit on what was coming out of a wastewater plant, and some very courageous decisions were made about how to build a very complicated system out on Deer Island. And then they actually made a very courageous decision to move the outfall where actually nitrogen was needed, or it's limited, not limited out in Mass Bay. But I wish life was as simple as what we did on Boston Harbor. Again, a point source dominated situation where we had one massive discharger. To take on challenges like Lake Champlain and Cape Cod, we needed a more systemic approach, because there are thousands of sources of nitrogen that we have to deal with, or phosphorus when it comes to Lake Champlain. It required a different kind of thinking, a vastly different kind of thinking to take this on. And it really required an engagement with communities at a very heartfelt level about what this problem is. And this conversation about how to communicate data is entirely relevant to that question. We needed to enlist the public understanding of solving a problem that was as personal as how much nitrogen you put on your lawn, or what goes down your toilet, or what you do in terms of other contributions to the system. Now, the last few years, we've been trying to be more holistic about how we think about it. By that, I mean engaging our state and local partners in the solution conversation. I'm going to talk a little bit about where we got to when it came to Lake Champlain, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Cape Cod and a holistic planning tool we use there we call the 208 provision in the Clean Water Act. These examples speak to the complexity of the challenge, but also the need to innovate about solution, and how we've tried to set up a platform in both those places that invites innovation to get it done. It is traditional Clean Water Act, but it's using provisions, for example, in 208. No one's done a 208 plan in New England for decades. The fact that we got a 208 plan done for the Cape, that it embraced innovation in doing it, is really important as we go forward. So let's start with Lake Champlain. Now I'm going to use some Clean Water Act speak here. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of the word TMDL. We got a few hands up. That's terrific. Then you know what it is. It's a total maximum daily load analysis. What we actually think about is just how much can this system absorb. When we talk about complicated algorithms, there's some complicated modeling that helped us do that. Again, a great opportunity for innovation. We need to understand how much that system can assimilate to meet the water quality goals of the lake. 3/4 of the lake did not meet Vermont's water quality goals by a wide margin. The problem up there is severe. Blue-green algae in the northern part of the lake. Literally, imagine, and you all know this around New England, imagine you see all these homes around a body of water, all built as second homes, places people love to go. Imagine not being able to touch the water, because if you did, and it's dermally absorbed, you would have health effects. If you let your dog swim in it, and he slops it in like dogs do, blah, 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 in comes the water, they would literally potentially die from the toxic algae in the lake itself. So what we were going to do to solve that? Well, we had to do this TMDL. We had to set targets for 12 lake segments. We needed to look at all the sources, wastewater treatment plants, runoff from roads, both paved and unpaved. We had to look at agriculture and forest lands, erosion and unstable stream corridors. We had to look at everything. The underlying analysis shows that it's the whole landscape we have to address. It's not just the wastewater plant. again, how are we going to address the whole landscape? There's enormous room for thinking through what will work to deal with that problem. We needed to create targets from each source and then get action. And I'm proud to say that Vermont stood up on this. Governor Shumlin and the legislature passed legislation to go ahead and implement all these actions across the landscape to reduce phosphorus. One of the most challenging parts of that is, what do you do about all those dairy farms with all that manure and all those cows, which, speaking of lack of systemic thinking, the U.S. Department of Agriculture actually subsidized those cows being on that landscape with low interest loans. So think about it for a minute. Don't think too hard about it, because you'll get a headache. But the bottom line is, we have an awful lot of cows in the northern parts of Lake Champlain because they are actually subsidized to be there. Now we're trying to figure out how to deal with that manure, and we're going to ask people from here to figure out a way to take manure and turn it into energy and other sources. In fact, that is in fact what's going on. And I think the good thing is USDA is actually thinking about this now. And I must tell you, if President Obama did one thing different than presidents before him, he made his cabinet secretaries actually sit and talk about these problems together instead of the silos that characterized the work before. I've been told in previous administrations, these cabinet secretaries literally schemed against each other in terms of trying to get their priorities through. This president forced those conversations. He created a green cabinet, in fact, to have those conversations. Now, Vermont's done some cutting edge things. Most exciting is actually their Agency of Transportation is involved. Of course, their Department of Agriculture. We actually engaged those people at the beginning. We took a systemic approach to the problem, and good things are happening, and there's been a response. So now I want to turn to Cape Cod. Now, I don't know how many of you have been to Cape Cod. Yeah, a lot. Cape Cod today is very different than it was 30 years ago. The amount of development on Cape Cod has been astounding. What's wrong on Cape Cod? I think it's in the neighborhood of 150,000 backyard wastewater systems. How many of you know the soils of Cape Cod? You must know. It's sand. There's nothing to Cape Cod but sand. So you can imagine water from your house through your toilet or through your sink. Where does it go? It goes into that backyard system, it goes into the sand, and it just travels with very little natural attenuation in the soils and moves right to the waterways, which leads to problems with dissolved oxygen and algae growth. The problem in saltwater systems is ulva, macroalgae. It fouls the beaches. When it builds up enough, it rots, and you get smelly egg sound, a rotting smell that's really, really, it can be an irritant. I wouldn't call it an air pollutant, but it is an irritant to people if they smell too much of it. So there are 71 embayments around Cape Cod that we're dealing with. There's been TMDLs for approximately 150 water body segments. The nitrogen reductions are astounding, what we need to achieve, all the way up to, in some places, 87% reduction. That's in front of us. Hasn't been done. We got to do it. Among the controllable sources, 78% comes from septic system, 9% from fertilizer, 8% from impervious surface, 5% from wastewater. I got to tell you, at EPA, we're good with wastewater. Backyard systems, the Clean Water Act doesn't give us that authority. So what did we come to finally? Again, bringing a systemic view to this, we pulled an old authority off the shelf called the Section 208 of the Clean Water Act. Back in the day, in the early Clean Water Act days, every place did a 208 plan, which was supposed to get at this issue of how to control water pollution off your landscape. Of course, it didn't take, and it wasn't really used going forward. But the Cape's problem was so severe, it needed to be the tool. And we were able to connect with the Cape Cod Commission, the state of Massachusetts. At the local level, we did intense engagement using engagement tools from places like Emerson College and elsewhere. And we actually sat down and had a very strong, robust conversation about how to deal with the problem. The centerpiece of this is the Cape Cod Commission. They've undertaken a tremendous effort to actually put plans in place that embrace new technologies. Now, this is where the Cape is very different. If this was a conversation that was going to occur 10 years ago, you would have state and EPA regulators talking about running big pipes and building wastewater plants, literally creating more wastewater, and I'll speak to that point in a minute. What's happened on the Cape is we've embraced the idea of new technology. So for each town is going to have the opportunity to create a plan on a sub-watershed basis and embrace new technologies in terms of how they might solve this nutrient pollution problem. We invite everyone to come to those conversations and to figure out how these towns may meet their challenge. They're on a one-year schedule to do it, and I think that year started in June, so they have months left to speak about how they will apply new techniques to household, neighborhood, and community levels to implement source pollution reductions focusing on nitrogen. We hope the community engagement continues to be part of this. It is vital. But I need to tell you, these two examples are really new ways of the agency thinking about these problems. They come from a lot of the work that was done around the Mid-Atlantic region when it comes to Chesapeake Bay, that was mentioned earlier, and some very creative thinking within my office about how to make that happen. The last point I want to speak to about our water strategy that's ongoing on innovation is a new program that we've been able to secure basically because of the leadership of Senator Jack Reed from Rhode Island. One of the responses in the Clean Water Act to this fact that you need to operate on the landscape scale is what we call geographic programs, or Section 320 of the Clean Water Act, which created these national estuary programs. And about 20 years, maybe less than 20 years in, but about that, in terms of thinking about clean water problems, Congress realized we need to have these more global plans for iconic water. So, for example, Narragansett Bay, Long Island Sound, Massachusetts Bay, Casco Bay. These are all estuaries we call of national significance, and they have the ability to do what we call comprehensive conservation management plans, CCMPs, to try to deal with their problems. That's terrific, but anything that says comprehensive conservation management plan is a challenge just in its design. So what we worked with the Senator's office on is the idea of a program that covers the area from Westerly to Chatham, where there are already plenty of plans, to further the idea of new technology and innovation in that geographic space around the water mission that's outlined in those plans. So we have something called the Southern New England Program. In 2014, we got $2 million. In 2015, we got $5 billion. In a week or two, there'll be a new RFP out on it. And what it tries to incent is partners coming together. So will Woods Hole connect with maybe URI? Would NGO from Buzzards Bay connect to an NGO from Narragansett Bay? Can we start to do things on scale across that space? And can we see new ideas, be it modeling ideas, technology ideas, communication ideas, any idea that will advance reduction of nitrogen loadings across that space in the context of rising seas and warming waters. Pretty challenging mission. But we do have, not chump change, $5 million is a lot of money still to me and probably to you. Our grants are going out at levels of hundreds of thousands of dollars. We're not doing 100 grants with $5 million. We're doing larger body grants that are multi-year that can get serious thinking going across that space. We're ambitious that region could be an innovation hub for dealing with the nitrogen pollution problem, the nutrient problem. We'll see what happens. Equally important is trying to deal with probably the most challenged water body in our New England area, and that's Long Island Sound. As we know, millions of people live in that watershed. There's a great story to tell about how, for example, Connecticut put a trading program in to reduce nitrogen loadings very significantly. So much was accomplished using a very classic approach, using point source point source permitting and trading as a way to do that. We are challenged. If you look at New York City, and it's always important for people to understand just the great change in there. If you think about Long Island Sound, when our forebears came to this country and they met the Native Americans who are living there, what was then is not today. Who thought it was a good idea to collect all this water in the Catskills, put it through the homes of millions of people, and then discharge it in the western end of Long Island Sound, which flushes very poorly, I'd like to ask them who thought, was that a good idea? Because right now it's not. Millions and millions of pounds of nitrogen is loaded into the Western Sound, creating serious problems. And we know there's really no solution associated with just treating wastewater from New York City. New York City I don't know if you've seen a wastewater plant in New York City, but it's an amazing thing, amazing piece of engineering just to see it wedged into all that is on that island. So what we need to think about with Long Island Sound is, again, a holistic, bigger approach. We hope to reset the Long Island Sound effort around innovation, whole watershed thinking, more engagement, much like what we've done on the Cape. We've just published a CCMP, a Conservation Comprehensive Management Plan for Long Island Sound that actually embraces those ideas. It's very accessible, and I urge you to go see and look at that. So it's clear that what we're trying to do with water now is a lot of what was discussed at your panel. It's a lot of trying to leverage the great creativity and capability in all aspects of our university capability in this region. Because it isn't just about the machine or the technology at the end. It's about data, it's about communication, it's about all the challenges it takes to move a water solution at the community level. Now, I wish it was that easy that we could just reframe and create a new paradigm and just have it happen. But I've got some questions for you to consider to close. How will communities afford to protect low-lying water infrastructure? Now let's think about that for a minute. Where is the wastewater plant in most communities? It's in the floodplain. So we've spent decades getting people to build these very expensive structures in the most vulnerable place they could possibly be built for sustaining clean water going forward. It's what I call the pipe and treat strategy. Again, I wish somebody was thinking back then a little more about sustainability and systems thinking, but again, we weren't thinking about sea level rise, and we weren't thinking about warming waters, and we weren't thinking about climate change during that time. Maybe we should have been. But now we have this really serious problem of all this technology, very, very high-end sunk cost, billions of dollars spent to build wastewater treatment in places that are high hazard areas now, and by 2100 will be underwater, no doubt about it. We're talking 3 to 6 feet of sea level rise in New England, and we're talking about communities who don't have a lot of money. If you want to come see a distressed community, join me in New Bedford, or join me in Fall River, or come see New Haven. These are distressed communities. Next question. Will flooding force us to make restoring watershed resilience a primary goal of water protection goals? Now, let me share a story with you. When I was on the job about 3 months, and I got a call from Rhode Island, and it was something I'd never seen before. They had a stacked set of rain events in March, just one after another, that had created such a significant rise in the groundwater table and saturation in the soils that the next rain event simply flooded the area. So you had 4 feet of water on Route 95 as you passed through Rhode Island. 95 was closed. If you look to your right, there was a wastewater plant. The buildings were underwater, literally, right to the ceiling of the buildings. All the infrastructure was destroyed. And what was interesting about that was there was a 6-foot berm around the wastewater plant. This was a 500-year flooding event. Now, there were 2 watersheds that experienced this flooding event. There was one called the Pawcatuck watershed, which is down in the southern end of Rhode Island, and the watershed where the wastewater plant was the Pawtuxet watershed. Entirely different watersheds. One, their green infrastructure was conserved. What I mean by green infrastructure, I mean their natural wetlands and forests and all that. There was a state park up in that watershed. It's called Arcadia Park. So all that rain fell, and there was a delay and a slow move of all the water down through the watershed. So the flooding was managed in Westerly. Eventually, the train tracks, the Amtrak train track went underwater, but only for a day or two. In Pawtuxet, on the Pawtuxet watershed, the Warwick Mall was destroyed, the wastewater plant was destroyed, homes were destroyed. The level of pain and suffering from low-income people living in West Warwick and other low-income areas was terrible. Bottom line is, if we'd been managing by the watershed, understanding that our primary goal is watershed resilience, as much as it is meeting a water quality goal, the problems in the Patuxent could have been averted. Today, we're not managing that way. Our law doesn't really line us up that way. And we're challenged to do it as we go forward. We need to take lessons from these experiences and really rethink how we're doing it. When it comes to, for example, daylighting streams, our friends at the Charles River Watershed Association are proposing these ideas, restoring floodplains. This needs to be the water mission of the next century. We need to fundamentally rethink what we're doing, not just meeting a water quality goal with treatment and technology, but how we actually enhance watershed resilience. The last thing I want to bring to you is the notion of trying to eliminate the term wastewater. Can we achieve that goal? What's ahead? I have this conversation with my friends going back to Long Island Sound. What is the solution for New York City? Do we mandate another 2 milligrams per liter of treatment on all their wastewater plants to go from 5 milligrams per liter to 3 milligrams per liter at a diminishing cost curve that's really hard to even fathom for that city? Or do we think about the fact that New York in the future is going to be so hot? The heat island effect in New York is going to be brutal. How about using the water from all that wastewater and not calling it wastewater and call it cooling water for the future New York? We need to start thinking about that now, because if you think about the engineering and technology challenge of taking all this water that now flows on a pipe and treat strategy to actually putting it back into the system to cool and make New York more habitable in a climate change world, that we got to start now. And maybe the conversation shouldn't be about another 2 milligrams or 3 milligrams of treatment at their wastewater plants. Maybe it's about how do we reduce volume going into the Western Sound in the first place. Maybe it's about reversing that bad idea that was put in place 100 years ago when people started piping wastewater to Long Island Sound. These are, I think, the challenges that MIT and all the great universities in this region need to take up. They need to chart a workable course about how we get from where we are today and a paradigm that will inevitably fail. The Clean Water Act has not been reauthorized since 1982, I believe. I was part of an effort to reauthorize it in the mid-90s. It failed because of why everything else is failing in Congress. People are operating in mindsets and paradigms that aren't really about systems and practical solutions. So here in New England, I think we can really get that done. There's one last challenge I want to pose to you. This is a fascinating experience. I have another one that happened yesterday. I got to tell you, if anybody ever has a chance to have my job, take it. It's an awesome job. I was out in Woburn yesterday, not Woburn. I was out in Concord and Acton, surveying a Grace site where we built a water treatment system. The story is I guess I can tell it here. So this is fascinating, especially for the topic today. So we're finding a very problematic emergent contaminant called 1,4-dioxane. Does anybody know what 1,4-dioxane is? Some of you do. It's used in everything, like solvents. It's a stabilizer, I think, for solvents and other things. It's even in household products like shampoos and all that. So it's an emergent contaminant. Like a lot of persistent contaminants, it ends up in groundwater. Now, we don't know entirely what it means to health, human health, but it's a bad thing if it gets into groundwater, and especially a bad thing if it gets into drinking water. So, of course, out in Concord, where you had Grace Chemical Company, they had a lot of 1,4-dioxane in their solvents. They dumped their solvents in the ground, and then the solvents ended up in the groundwater. So we're requiring Grace to pump and treat their groundwater. Very common thing in Superfund. So this is almost comical. So they have 1,4-dioxane, and everybody's worried about 1,4-dioxane. So we're asking them to treat that 1,4-dioxane, and there's really no technology that's very good for doing it. So they found some technology from Canada that has an enormous carbon footprint that's reducing 1,4-dioxane from 2.5 parts per million, I believe, to 1.5 parts per million. And then they're discharging that wastewater into a kettle pond. It's not going anywhere. We're forcing them to do something that by any measure is probably bad for the climate because we have very tight regulation about this 1,4-dioxide. Another example of how we need to think more systemically about things. There's a great little community out in Western Massachusetts. I can't say what they are because it's an enforcement thing. I'll be right there in 2 minutes. It's an enforcement matter, and I have to be somewhat, I can speak in the general about it. So this community is next to a river, and of course in the 50s, the Army Corps built enormous dikes to protect these communities, a little like what they did for New Orleans. Now this community has combined sewers. That was another great idea. Let's put the sewage in the storm drain system. Well, of course, now we have overflows and sewage running into rivers. So they've been under a 20-year consent decree with us to fix their combined sewer system. Now they've done 4 phases of it, and that's terrific. They're actually a very well-performing community in that area. They've come to me and said, you know, that last phase, which has very diminishing return, we'd like to put that off 20 years. Now this is a consent agreement with the Department of Justice filed before a judge. So if they don't perform, we can fine the living heck out of them. Well, we'd like to put that off so we can build some pumps to pump out our town if the water comes over the dams, over the dikes, which inevitably it probably will in a climate future we're all talking about. I can't tell you how hard that conversation is going to be. They're literally asking us not to enforce law. That's a hard thing for EPA. That's what we do. That's what we do. I don't know how that conversation is going to turn out, but I'm going to tell you, it's going to involve me having to meet 25 lawyers right into Washington, probably talking to the Department of Washington Justice at the highest level to get the flexibility to not enforce the law. And if some environmental group wants to take issue with that, well, then they'll sue me instead of the town. That's the situation we're in right now. I speak to this as an invitation for all of you who work on these issues to get involved with the whole system in terms of thinking about water and what we need to do going forward. So I thank you for your time. Questions?
Thank you, Mr. Spalding. We do have time for a couple more questions. Does anybody have a question? Please come to the microphone.
I'm mic'd up here. Is this on? Or do I have to? Yeah, it is good. All right, great.
Out loud. Leo Banchik from MIT. Just a quick question. You mentioned new technologies being used in Cape Cod communities. Yeah. What kind of technologies are you?
Oh, you know, the conversation speaks to most of it's simple stuff, but part of the conversation was, can you separate urine and fecal waste, have them go to different receptacles, and literally have a truck come along and take the fecal waste especially, so that can be recycled and composted. Urine also, there's a project up in Vermont which is about recycling urine because it's actually a terrific nutrient. You know, this nutrient cycle I talked about, you know, we make the fertilizer. I guess you all are aware that most people consider the making of chemical fertilizer one of the transformative things that happened to actually feed the world. I mean, if we didn't make fertilizer out of oil, the starvation in this world would be incredible. So, but we've got to think about just where that nitrogen goes. And so that's one example. The Gates Foundation has funded something called the Gates Toilet. The other conceptual idea is, well, why do we put our human waste in water in the first place? Think about all the public health problems that have been created by human waste in water. You need to go to the developing world to see it, cholera and all those issues. That's because we put the waste in the water, and the water ends up in the river, and then the clothes are washed in the river, and then the disease comes into the home, and you know the disease cycle. So they're talking about dry systems, that kind of thing, chemical systems, separation systems, a lot of ideas like that. Of course, the classic located in Cambridge was the Clivus Multrum toilet, remember? Very simple technology, been used for years. Yes?
Mr. Spalding, can I answer that question
Yeah.
to Leo as well? My name's Nolan Nikias, and I'm representing the Water Systems Science and Society program at Tufts University.
Okay.
And last year, a group of graduate students did work on exploring a lot of different technologies with the Cape Cod Commission. And if you go to greenguide.wordpress.com. It explores a lot of those technologies, so people might find that interesting.
So just to amplify that, the more people that are interested in what's happening on Cape Cod, the more likely all those little towns will do it. So our biggest problem is always this: what happens at town meeting in the middle of winter, and someone says you're going to have to pay more for something. That's a social problem. But when people come in and say, I have new ideas, ways to do this that'll be much less expensive, it builds some momentum. Yes?
Hi, my name is Bonnie. I'm from the University of Vermont. And
Terrific.
yeah, thanks for talking about it. It was awesome. We have a lot of really great social innovation going on. Our response to Hurricane Irene as a
I
society
didn't talk about that, yeah.
was, it made it easier for us to work on policy because it kind of became more of a consensus in our society that we need to do more in sustainable development, which is the second phase of environmentalism. Like, you talked a lot about policies that came out of classical environmentalism, but now we're more as a second phase during going into sustainable development, in which we take a critical view of what we're doing and where we are living and how we're acting, and critique it so it's actually self-sustaining. So,
Raw.
well, yeah.
Good.
So,
Come work for EPA. We need your ideas. Go
well,
ahead.
the thing is, what about communities like Cape Cod, where they're, because of things like ocean expansion, because the oceans are getting warmer, sharks are going up and making the beaches less usable for people, and the response from the community is people wanting to get rid of the sharks, thus taking out the predator, thus increasing seal population and having fish.
Let me cut you off there. Actually, the sharks have enhanced Cape Cod tourism. Believe it or not. Beachgoers still go, but people want to come see the sharks. Literally. There's nothing like the apex predator to get humans excited. I think that goes to, we do have evolutionary biologists in the room. They'll tell us why. Yes, Cape Cod, your big point about Cape Cod. If I was to say there's one place in this East Coast world that's going to really have challenges with climate change, it is Cape Cod. It's literally moving. I did a tour and went out to the end of Cape Cod and got a briefing. This much rise across Stellwagen Bank changes all the dynamics of how sand moves, and all Cape Cod is a sand spit, just a really big one. And so the arm is moving south. Literally, the beach is the place is moving. And so you make a great point. The challenge on Cape Cod is very multifaceted. And the good thing, though, is the communities there are sort of jumping up to it. They've got more solar built on Cape Cod than just about anywhere in the country because they have their own energy cooperative across the Cape. So they're essentially building solar and then buying it themselves. It's kind of an interesting economic opportunity for them. So an awful lot of great stuff's happening on the Cape. And so I hope that addresses your general concern.
Yeah, if only that their own environmental impact would only affect them, when really it's everyone's environmental impact affecting everyone.
No, that's right. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And Cape Cod's overdeveloped. They've got big challenges going forward. Yes? I'm not sure I'd buy coastal property there.
Hi, my name is Elena. I'm from Boston College.
Hi.
And my question was about, you talked about point sources being pretty well defined, and that's something that we can more easily remediate. But could you talk a little bit about non-point sources and how, especially in the TMDL studies, how those are quantified, and is there room to grow in that area?
Yes. Well, you notice I didn't use the word non-point sources. I think about landscapes and try to redefine the challenge around nitrogen off landscape. And indeed, the opportunity to model these is very, very significant. Our Office of Research and Development has done modeling on stormwater. They've done modeling on what comes off of agricultural land, forested land. There's a pretty good idea. The whole TMDL Lake Champlain is probably one of the most advanced pieces of work when it comes to modeling non-point sources. Because the fact of the matter for Lake Champlain, 95% of the problem is non-point sources. Only less than 5% comes from wastewater sources, wastewater plants, treated wastewater. So we're growing in our ability to do that. I think the work, our Office of Research and Development has really embraced trying to build models that can help, especially local government, because the challenge around non-point sources is it's not really regulated by the federal government. That's one. If you ever followed, a couple of years ago, I was at the law school at Harvard had this wonderful forum with all the people who wrote the Clean Water Act in the day. And all these old guys come in and talk about the policy debates at the formation of the Clean Water Act. And there was a vicious, hard line drawn that the federal government should not regulate land use, period. It's like, if you want to go have a fight down there, well, look at the fight about the Clean Water Rule right now. 26 states are suing us for simply defining what a wetland is and what the hydrological connection to the water resources really is. And then we drew a boundary that some of us here in New England was pretty conservative, and yet we're being slammed, just torn apart by people who think we should not be touching land use. So the challenge with non-point sources is the authorities to do it are state and local. And that's the beauty of what's happened on Lake Champlain and the fact that Vermont has stepped up. It's $10 million a year. It's probably got to be bigger in time. And we hope the Cape Cod community step up. And we think the state of Massachusetts is going to stand behind the models and the plans and all those things that need to be done in the Cape. But the challenge is a federal policy maker, or policy implementer. I'm not a policy maker. That's important to know. Regions implement, Washington conceives. We need a few people down there in the conception area paying attention to us implementers. But that said, the non-point challenge is what happens at the state, at the local level. And that's why I think a lot of the work that was spoken about by NOAA, being able to communicate complex data in a very simple, direct way to local people who are volunteers or pay very low amounts of money is essential. It's like, that's what the Cape Cod Commission has done so well, and hopefully it'll sustain good decision-making in each of those communities on the Cape. One more question?
So kudos for creative thinking within regulatory frameworks. Have to recognize your work, and Ken, your work, to figure out how we can be creative, because we do need regulatory frameworks. We do need lawsuits and consent decrees sometimes to make the right outcomes happen. So my challenge to MIT and the students here is to sort of not just think about technology and where you're going to create or deliver to markets. Think about where the needs are, and Curt alluded a little bit to that. Let's have you guys actually be town engineers in these small communities on the coast to get your creative juices flowing on how these communities can actually use some creative engineering and technology to overcome or at least address some challenges.
Yeah.
And also, a little bit of what Curt talked about is, the mindset or the engineering sort of baggage that we've been carrying about thinking about different silos that water is always put in, wastewater, stormwater, water supply, and it's time that you guys break those silos in ways that needs to happen right away, and figure out ways those systematic or systems thinking can actually be put into practice.
I will say the Charles River Watershed Association is probably one of the most innovative policy shops in the whole country on rethinking the water challenge. Bob Zimmerman visits us from time to time and always opens our minds up to ways we need to think about these problems. And it's pretty exciting stuff to think what might happen in our cities if you follow Executive Director Zimmerman's ideas. So thank you all very much. Thank you.
Once again, thank you to Administrator Curt Spalding. I would like to invite Professor Leonhardt to present a gift to you from MIT Co-op.
Thank you.
Please join us again for our last panel at 2 p.m. and we do have lunch for you outside. Thank you.